welcome to our very exciting lecture and workshop today. It's a real honour to bring this work to you. I think it's quite a novel workshop. I've never attended one myself. Everything that we share today are the lessons that we've learned. Well, Gill's delivering the lecture, but that we've learned along the way, because it's really important to generate work through research data, through qualitative and creative methods. But once you've got all this data, what do you do with it? And to interpret that evidence in the absence of the people who created it, you can really lose meaning. And the whole point of the exercise will be defeated if you sit with the data alone and try to say, what were they trying to say here? What were they trying to do there? What is the point of this whole exercise? And over the years, I came to realize that there is no way that one can interpret the results of qualitative work, and particularly work that was created through participatory methods, in the absence of the storyteller and the owner of that work, the author of that work. So Gill's going to take you through some steps today that you can use to interpret your work in a participatory way. Thank you, Gill.
Thank you, Astrid. It's great to be here again. Thanks for asking me to deliver the lecture today, to see all the familiar faces and this lovely space that we have. So thank you for coming. It's great to see you all again. And as always, thanks so much to Amira and Nicola for organising everything so it just falls so beautifully into place. So the lecture today really builds upon the lecture last week on creative research methods. And so if you were here last week, then a lot of the methods that I talk about will be familiar to you. But if you weren't here, if you weren't able to join us last week, don't worry, because the methods will become familiar as we go through the talk. So today I'm going to be talking about participatory analysis of creative data as integration for transdisciplinary research. And this is going to be a lecture in 5 parts. First of all, we're going to be looking at, well, what is participatory analysis of creative data and why is it important in transdisciplinary research? Then I'm going to present 2 case studies, hoping I haven't bitten off too much here, presenting 2, but I really wanted to give you a sense of more than one project and how participatory analysis has been used with 2 very different groups of, very many different groups of people on different topics. Then we will discuss the considerations and challenges of participatory analysis, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions and answers before we go into the workshop. So what is the participatory analysis of creative data, and why is it important in transdisciplinary research? So these methods will be familiar to all of you that attended the lecture last week, where I gave examples of creative and participatory research methods with focus on body mapping, community mapping, digital storytelling, and photo voice. And of course, these types of arts-based research methods, and there are many more, this is just examples, they support people who are affected of or at risk of a health-related challenge to illustrate and to articulate their lived experience and their insights in relation to that challenge. So creative methods then generate material outputs and evidence that can stand alone, or it can be used for the purposes of co-production in transdisciplinary research. So traditional research often treats analysis as something that researchers do, rather than something researchers, research participants, and stakeholders can do together. And creative methods can produce rich contextualized data that enhance evidence generation in research initiatives by people who directly experience the research problem, and data that is generated through the use of creative and arts-based methods can be analysed alongside and integrated with wider data sets, including quantitative findings, and it can be examined, interpreted, and presented by the participants who generate those data. So participatory analysis can play an important role, helping to convert lived experiences, knowledge, and insights that is held within tangible symbolic materials into research concepts, research themes, and action plans. And this can inform strategic interventions that are relevant to the people and the places that most need them. So going on to then examples of participatory analysis in practice. And the first case study is the Water and Fire project, which was run between 2019 and 2022 in Cape Town. The work was led by Stirling University. They held the grant, which was a UKRI GCRF grant, and all of the field work was done in South Africa and led in Cape Town and led by the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation. So the aims and objectives of the Water and Fire project, and in the long name, the very long name of this project, was enhancing capacity and reducing risk through 15 best bets for transformative adaptation with vulnerable residents on the Cape Flats. And the objectives of this project were to address disaster risk challenges associated with 3 environmental hazards. And the hazards that we were exploring were fire, localized flooding and water shortage in 3 marginalized South African communities on the Cape Flats, to test new methods of democratic engagement for generating community-derived solutions and resilience action in response to these environmental hazards, to co-develop these solutions into a series of best bets for the consideration and input of affected communities, government departments and academic stakeholders, and to enhance local capacity to reduce environmental disaster risk, as well as raising the potential for scaled-up impact. So in the Water and Fire project, the 3 research sites that we worked in were Delft, where the focus was very much on water shortage, and we were looking back at the experiences of people during the water crisis, particularly during the year 2018. Sweet Home Farm, where we were looking at, which is an informal settlement close to Philippi, where the focus was on flooding, and Overcome Heights, which is an informal settlement more in the southern part of Cape Town, where we were looking at runaway fires. And Overcome Heights has a history of having had many fires. It's a hot, windy location, which is really plagued by fire outbreaks year after year. So, of course, with hot, windy, dry conditions, we're expecting more fires, as well as flooding and drought. So the research methods that we used, well, first of all, there was a household survey, and that was conducted during COVID-19 with 600 adult residents, so 200 in each of those sites, where we generated quantitative and qualitative data and really got a good demographic outline of these areas, and also started to make inquiries about people's experiences of these environmental hazards. And then after the household survey was complete, we moved into a layered visual methods approach, where we used digital storytelling first, and then we moved into a community mapping process, and then we moved into photo voice. And then after all of those 3 methods had been completed in each community, and we worked with each community separately, we undertook a participatory analysis of visual materials that was done by the CBCRs and facilitated by the SLF team, Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation team. So across the 3 research settings, we worked with a total of 30 adults. There were more involved in the community mapping because everybody brought a buddy for the community mapping. But for the photo voice and the digital storytelling, we worked with a total of 30 people. And they had been brought onto the research project because they had expressed concern about the topic and a desire to be on the project. So the range of ages was 22 to 62. We had women and men, mainly women on the project, with a representation of different cultural groups, with isiXhosa and Afrikaans-speaking community members, and they resided in different areas of the research settings. And they were available to take part for the duration of the project, which really meant a 2-year commitment. So availability was really a key aspect in bringing people on board as community-based co-researchers. So as I said, we started out with digital storytelling. We then moved into community mapping, and then we finished off with photo voice. And the same methods and the same process was followed in all of the 3 research settings, following an iterative process of inquiry, where the findings from one method informed the questions and the implementation of the next method. So in digital storytelling, we were exploring lived experience, personal experiences, emotion, agency, and the consequences of these environmental hazards at a personal and household level. The community mapping was more about exploring spatial relationships in the areas where the community co-researchers were living, neighbourhood patterns and localised risks, and photo voice was exploring more around everyday practices, adaptive behaviours and resilience actions, in the knowledge that different visual methods enable different analytical insights. I'm not going to go into the detail of this slide, but just to suffice to say here that following the data creation stage, so following the digital storytelling, the community mapping, and the photo voice, we went into the participatory analysis, which had 4 phases. So phase one involved reviewing all of the visual materials. Phase 2 involved selecting examples that best represented the key themes. Phase 3 involved interpreting and triangulating findings across the method, and then the 4th phase involved developing the best bets. So, phase 1, identifying problems and solutions through iterative thematic analysis. So once the digital storytelling, community mapping, and photo voices were all complete, we carried out an iterative analysis of firstly the stories, secondly the maps, and thirdly the photographs. And we were looking in depth at the evidence that had been created. What are the biggest problems you see, and what makes these problems worse? And what are the potential solutions you see? So what makes the problems, in other words, less bad? And there wasn't any requirement for the community-based co-researcher to do matching between problems and solutions. It was just asking what problems do you see in your photos, in your stories, and in your maps, and what solutions do you see in these visual materials. So the co-researchers watched all of the digital stories collectively. So this was the co-researchers from each site working independently of each other at different points in the year. So they watched, say for example, the group from Delft, they watched their digital stories together collectively. And then we asked them to individually, by themselves, identify 1 big problem and 2 of the best solutions that they saw really running through this collection of personal experiences. And then they wrote them down, and the group then reviewed all of the problems that had been identified, all of the solutions that had been identified, had a collective discussion of the similarities and differences, and agreed upon the major recurrent themes. So the most frequently cited problems and solutions, the ones that they agreed were coming up most commonly and across these stories, were ring-fenced and kind of put to one side. Then there was the community mapping analysis. So the community maps were exhibited in a gallery format, and they were considered as a single data set. And these were hand-drawn community maps. So you may remember that last week I talked about the use of aerial photography as well as a method, a creative method for data generation. These were hand-drawn community maps. Every person in the group had created their own. And so they were laying out on the floor, exhibited in a gallery format, considered as a single data set, and then excluding the problems and solutions that had been ring-fenced and put to one side from the previous analysis. Again, we asked the participants to identify 1 big problem that they saw in these maps and the 2 best solutions. Again, write them down on cards. and then work collectively as before. The cards go up on the wall, everybody looks at them, talks about them, what are the problems that are coming out as the most common problems, and solutions coming out as the most prominent solutions. Again, those were ring-fenced and put to one side.
Ask a clarification.
Yes.
So you had three different contexts.
Three different contexts.
And the co-researchers
Yes.
were drawn from all three into one cohort.
So that we were
Three different.
Yes. So we were no. So yes, three different environmental hazards. So the contexts were Delft, where we were looking at water shortage, Sweet Home Farm, where we were looking at flooding, and Overcome Heights, where we were looking at fires. And in each of those settings, we worked with a group of community-based co-researchers. Yes, sorry. They didn't all work together. They did at the very end. They all came together for a big government engagement, what we called an Indaba. But initially, when they were doing these methods and generating their materials and doing their analysis, they were working separately. Okay, thanks for that. So again, with the photo voice images displayed in a gallery format, everybody looked at them. So the 10 CBCRs from the group looked at them individually, looked at what they saw as the biggest problem and the two best solutions that were coming through the photographs, wrote them down, collective discussion, what's the most frequent problem that we're seeing here, and what are the most prominent solutions that we're seeing here. Okay, so then we just made sure that all those discussions were documented, everything was captured, the problems and solutions that had been identified and agreed upon as being the most prominent were shared back, just to make sure that everything had been captured and understood correctly. Okay, so just a little visual here then to show that the biggest problems that had been seen across that iterative analysis process were ring-fenced, and the solutions were also ring-fenced. And again, as I said, we didn't ask for direct solution matching solutions to problems. So the next step then, so they had the problems and they had the solutions that they thought that were most important that were coming out through all of these visual materials. And then they selected examples of their visual outputs for presentation at engagement events. So which of the stories were best representing the biggest problems that they had identified? Which of them, and solutions, which of the maps were representing those best, and which of the photographs were representing those best, so that they had, because there were so many photographs, and obviously there were in the end there were many maps and stories, and so not everything could go on display. It would have been too much information. So it was like, well, what can we show that is really demonstrating what you were finding when you look at this, all of this material across the board? So they agreed on what were the best representative stories, maps, and photographs. In other words, the visual evidence that was considered to best represent these problems and solutions that they had drawn out. Okay, and then the third phase was this triangulation of data to develop the best bets, where they then reviewed and triangulated the theme solutions. So the problems are important, and the problems were I can't go into all the detail, I just don't have time. But because we were looking for best bets for resilience action and for disaster risk management, the focus from this point was put on the solutions, right? For best bets, what are the best bets to counteract? What do we see as coming out of these visual materials that are showing us what solutions are needed to either be amplified or gaps that need to be filled. So the top two most frequently cited solutions by all the site-specific community members across each round of iterative analysis, in other words, per method. So they identified the top 2 most frequently cited solutions from the digital storytelling, the top 2 from the community mapping, and the top 2 from the photo voice. So they had all selected 2, each of them, but then they were asked to together select 2 from the stories, 2 from the maps, and 2 from photographs. And it was those that were then considered after many rounds of discussion and debate and really putting the deliberation, what are the best bets to counteract or to mitigate these environmental hazards. All right. So for example, I'm just going to give you an example of the best bets that were outlined. So this is very, very high level. There was a lot more analysis that went in after we gotten to this point. But as what we call overarching ideas and overarching solutions, it was decided that more space was needed around houses and more exit points were needed within houses, that there need to be an improvement in the responsiveness of the emergency services and more support from local organisations, that the need for the community to work together was absolutely key and vital, to keep documents safe, because if you lose your ID and all those other important documents that you have, such as birth certificates or vaccination cards or anything, they can go up in flames in seconds. So better ways of keeping documents safe in the household, and then having access to water and sand, and being prepared for these, being more prepared for these fire outbreaks. So you'll notice here that there's only 5, and they had been asked to find 6. But in the end, there was a lot of crossover and overlap between the one around being preparedness by having access to water and sand. So they decided that should actually just be put together into one best bet. So then came the real unpacking, the 4th phase, unpacking the best bets and the development of the potential interventions. So for each of the best bets, so for example, the 5 that I've just shown you in Overcome Heights, the community members then worked together in small working groups and answered the questions to realise this best bet. In other words, to make this best bet happen, what is needed? What needs to be in place to actually make this best bet happen? And why are these specific measures needed? What will they do? What will they enable and allow? Who is responsible for meeting those needs, and how could it actually happen? So what are the mechanisms that need to be in place for this to be for these best bets to actually happen? So a lot of, let's just say, drilling down, thinking through, because it's very easy to say, well, we need more space around houses and more exit points within houses, but then we have to really unpack that and say, well, what in more detail, more specifically, what is needed, and then these questions. And so per each one of the best bets, they were asked to come up with 4 responses per small working group, so that we had a lot of different input and content around what's needed, why, who's responsible, and how could it actually happen? What are the mechanisms that need to be put in place? So this really was enabled then a progressive research inquiry, and we were looking very much at what could be done before, during, and after these climate-related events. We were looking at what can community residents do for themselves, and what are they unable to do that requires support from others. What kind of assistance is available to them already that needs to be amplified and expanded and ramped up, and where are the key gaps in responsiveness and support. And then, so the institutional researchers that were involved in this project also looked across all of these best bets and all of the in-depth analysis that had been done around the what, why, who, and how questions, and also in a cross-cutting way, so across all of the environmental hazards and all of the settings, the kind of agreement between the institutional researchers was that we really need to think with informality. So we need to strategize and work with informality rather than working against it, because informality is real, it's here to stay, it's not going away anytime soon, and we have to acknowledge that the future looks very different to the past, that there's a real need to allocate open space in public institutions for emergency refuge after any of these events, but particularly after fire and after flooding. And also there's a real need to promote knowledge and awareness through campaigns on what people can do to mitigate environmental disasters, and especially what they can do in the immediate aftermath. And I think that through working together, the community members from the 10 CBCRs that were involved from each of the settings learned from each other and then took those messages out into their households and into other formal or informal groups that they were part of in the communities where they lived or in the settings where they lived. So just to kind of like wrap this one up then. So there was a separate community engagement event in the 3 research settings, which was led by the CBCRs from that setting, where they showed the chosen stories, photographs, and maps, and they presented their data and their findings to community members who were invited to come to local community halls to engage with the project and its findings. There was a policy engagement event at the end of the project, which was, as I said, where all of the community members from the 3 research sites came together and engaged with policymakers or government officials from many different departments in the city of Cape Town that were relevant to these environmental disasters. All of the presentations were led by community members that had participated in the project, and then we moved into multi-stakeholder roundtable discussions of the best bets and the way that they had been unpacked, and the what, why, who, and how answers, and then there was a lot of input and discussion from the government officials, other people that were there. There were other people from civil society, NGOs, other community members that were there, that all got around the table together after the presentations and really talked through what was possible and practical, and what could be done in the short term and what could be done in the longer term, and what was just not going to be possible anytime soon. So these little pictures that you see, so there were infographics that were made from each of the best bets that came out through this iterative analysis process. So I'm going to leave it there for the Water and Fire project, but there's a website that's been dedicated to this project. There's a video that's been made about the project and about the methods and the analysis of the methods and the engagement events. And then there's just 2 of the publications that have come through. One of them is really about the methodology, the creative methods and how the creative methods were applied, and how the analysis was done. And then the second one is more about the co-development of the best bets, and how they look in terms of a more global landscape, and indeed the term harmscape. So just very quickly to acknowledge then the University of Stirling that led the project and all the other people that were involved. I'm not going to mention everybody, but here are the names and the logos of the people that were involved and made this project happen. So the second example I'm going to give is a more recent one. So this is current, and is what we call the WEMA project, which started in 2024 and will end next year in 2027. So WEMA is short for the impact of extreme weather events on the mental health of vulnerable populations in Africa. It is led from the African Health Research Institute at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and the principal investigator is Collins Iwuji. And there is a website that's dedicated to the WEMA project and other related climate change projects that are being run by ARI. So the challenge then is that we're obviously facing more frequent and intense extreme weather events around the world because of climate change. This is having growing impacts on livelihoods and health, and mental health remains overlooked in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, which is where this work is being done. With limited access to care for those who are most affected. So it's a really complex issue. Climate change and mental health is clearly a complex issue, and in order to really understand it better and to hope to do anything about it requires a collaborative approach. So WEMA brings together a multidisciplinary research team along with affected community members from 4 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa to build cross-cutting evidence through an inclusive and transdisciplinary approach, with more findings being mobilized to hopefully drive climate action. So the research instruments that are being used in the WEMA project are a systematic literature review, a prevalence survey, the household demographic surveillance survey, the digital storytelling work with the local community members, and then the participatory thematic analysis, which is the core part of this case study I'll be talking about today. But there's also an academic analysis of the digital stories that's being done as well, which is being led by Chanel, but I'm not sure if Chanel's been able to oh, there's Chanel sitting at the back. And the systematic literature review has indeed been published. So community engagement and involvement it's part of a broader community engagement strategy. So digital storytelling is part of a much broader community engagement and involvement strategy in the WEMA project, and indeed participation has been embedded across the research cycle of the WEMA project. It's being implemented by community engagement teams who are all social science researchers, and they are leading the CEI elements of the work at the different sites, with key partners being community-based co-researchers. So WEMA is providing, it's working as a primary qualitative research method, providing rich data that can be used in advocacy, that can also be analysed, obviously, and makes lived experience more visible and hopefully more actionable. So here is just some of the community-based co-researchers that we've been working with in the 4 sub-Saharan African settings, which are Burkina Faso, Kenya, Mozambique, and South Africa. So community members were up to 40 or 50 community members were invited to information meetings to learn more about the project and to potentially sign up. And then they were purposefully, so it's 10 per site, were purposefully selected by the community engagement teams to make sure that there was diversity, that the groups were well represented in terms of gender and age, and everybody who was brought into the project as a community-based co-researcher had presented an expression, had actually submitted an expression of interest, and had given a strong motivation for why they wanted to be involved in the project. And yet these are small numbers. And that is definitely a limitation of this kind of work, and why it has to be done as part of wider transdisciplinary research with other research instruments included. But the reason that the numbers are small is because of the intensity of the work with these individuals, and also the time frame through which they have to be involved in the project. and the amount of one-on-one facilitation and communication and everything else that is required. But the work that is done with the community-based co-research is really in depth. So altogether, across the 4 sites, there are 37 community-based co-researchers, 21 women and 16 men. They all have lived experience of extreme weather, with diverse and often precarious livelihoods, ranging in age from late teens into their 40s. So as I said, we're working in Burkina Faso, Kenya, Mozambique and South Africa. The CBCRs of Burkina Faso come from rural farming settings. In Kenya, they come from an urban slum in Nairobi. Then in South Africa, the CBCRs are coming from a semi-rural area called Embo, in KwaZulu-Natal, and then in Mozambique, the CBCRs live in Beira. And it's Makuru kwa Ruben, which is the slum in Nairobi, Makuru kwa Ruben. So Astrid and I, with support from Chanel, have been providing training and facilitation of these workshops. So we ran the 5-day workshops. So again, if you were here last week, you will have heard about the fact that a digital storytelling workshop takes 5 consecutive days. I can't go into that detail again now here. So we ran these 4 times 5-day workshops in each of the 4 settings. We had already done some online training before we went into these settings, and the online training was to strengthen the community engagement team's existing expertise in facilitation, particularly participatory facilitation. And then we did some more intensive training when we got to the sites, and then co-facilitated the delivery of the actual workshops with the community engagement teams. And Chanel was able to join us for 2 of the 4 workshops, which was great. And then there was on-site psychosocial support, which was absolutely vital, to have a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a social worker in the room who could provide immediate psychological first aid. And so over the 5 days, the CBCRs created their digital stories in response to this question: tell us a true story about a time in the recent past when you experienced an extreme weather event that affected your mental health. How did your thoughts and feelings shape your ability to get through the event? And is there anything that stands out in your memory, something that happened or something that you or someone else did that made it more difficult or made it even perhaps easier for you to bear the event? So there were 37 digital stories that were made across the 4 country contexts. These films are an average of 5 minutes each in duration. They contain hand-drawn images that were made by the community-based co-researchers, and they were all created in a local language. So we're working with 5 different languages across these different contexts and in stories. And so they're all available on the Shield website via the YouTube channel, and you can use that QR code if you want to go onto that website and watch those stories. So the participatory thematic analysis then was led by the community-based co-researchers, and so to identify what matters, grounded in lived experience, very site-specific in-depth analysis. It was a rapid process that was carried out over 2 to 3 days with the purpose of preparing for knowledge exchange with the scientists that were involved in the project, the institutional academic scientists. So I'd like us to maybe do another whole seminar on knowledge exchange and co-design and intervention planning and everything, because it's just not possible to fit it in here and give you any sense of the participatory thematic analysis part of the work. There's also an academic analysis, as I said, that's being led by Chanel. I'm not going to be able to talk about that today, but the paper of the academic thematic analysis of the digital stories is imminently going to be submitted. But both use the Braun and Clark analytical framework. Okay, so that's a picture from the participatory thematic analysis happening in Nairobi in Kenya. So, as mentioned, this was facilitated by community engagement teams at the site. So this was done after, obviously, after the digital stories were made, after Astrid and I and Chanel had all come back to the Western Cape. And this process, there was a protocol that was developed, was co-developed with the community engagement teams over a series of weeks to make sure that they had all been involved in how the participatory thematic analysis was going to be implemented, and then it was implemented by the researchers at the sites, with 7 to 10 CBCRs per site, depending on who was available. Most of them, fortunately, were available to come and take part in the participatory thematic analysis. And again, there was online psychosocial support that was made available. So, as I said, there was a co-developed protocol in advance with core training and site-specific sessions all done online. So, over 2 to 3 days, the process followed the first 4 steps of the Braun and Clark analytical framework: familiarization with the data, generating codes, identifying themes and reviewing themes, with additional activities being to then identify potential interventions or suggested responses, and to prioritize themes through a process of voting on the most important and common themes. So there were 7 domains of experience that were drawn from the prompt question, and those domains were looking at events, cognitive responses, emotional responses, common concerns, coping enablers, coping barriers, and mental health impacts. And I'm going to give you, so these slides were put together by Astrid, and presented at our recent scientific advisory board meeting in Kenya. So these are Astrid slides, and that it provides a summary of the cross-site findings for presentation. So the theme 1 was events, as I said, and sub-themes that came out from this. So the events that were most prominent were the destruction of homes, the loss of services, and people being displaced as a result of the extreme weather that they had experienced. And I should say that in Mozambique, the extreme weather event everybody focused on this cyclone Ida. It was still, although it happened many years ago, it still sits with people every single day. And when you ask them about extreme weather, that is what they come back to. Whereas in all the other sites, the extreme weather event that was the focus of the digital stories was flooding. So the second theme was to examine cognitive responses. So that what came out of this was elements of uncertainty, fear, and survival thinking, where to go, how to stay safe, concern for children, and just basic survival. And in more severe contexts, people demonstrated through their stories and through the analysis of their stories themselves existential fear and despair, with feelings of abandonment and uncertainty. The third theme was the emotional responses, layered and ongoing emotional distress. So conveyances of fear, panic, and anxiety, trauma, sadness, and stress, with experiences of grief and loss and emotional instability. And the stories very clearly showed that distress often continues well beyond the actual extreme weather event that people are referring to in their stories. Then what common concerns were raised through the stories, while ongoing insecurity and unmet needs, with a fear of recurrence of the extreme weather events, concern for the ongoing safety of family members, and the feeling that there is inadequate or very limited support or responsiveness from government bodies with persistent shortages of food, shelter and healthcare. So what were the coping enablers that came through the cross-site analysis was community and family networks being absolutely vitally important for coping. The people's faith and spirituality, and also the support from informal organisations and formal non-governmental organisations. The barriers to coping, so constraints on coping. So there's limited or unequal support from institutions that are supposed to be providing support, poor infrastructure and living conditions, financial strain and displacement, again, shortages of food, shelter and basic resources, all resulting in social and emotional stress. And the mental health impacts that came across through the participatory analysis of across sites in terms of extreme weather and mental health were anxiety, depression, trauma, post-traumatic stress, and with reported symptoms including insomnia, people being triggered, for example, when it starts raining, and emotional instability. So cross-cutting themes, there's clearly an ongoing chain of disruption. Extreme weather is obviously not in a single event, it's an unfolding crisis. So there are cascading impacts across shelter, sanitation, mobility, services and livelihoods, and a loss of dignity and social security. People lose their housing, their resources, they're entirely dependent on other people, they have inadequate support, and there is a really extreme lack of privacy in temporary accommodation for people who are displaced. So then there was a theme prioritization process. So through all the themes in each site, again, the CPCRs from all these different sites in all these different countries haven't met each other. They're working independently in a site-specific way. So they looked at, what in terms of all these different themes that they had come up with at their sites, all the themes that they had come up with through or sub-themes that they had come up with through looking at these different domains. What did they consider to be the most important? What was coming up most commonly for them, and what did they feel were the most overlooked issues that needed to be addressed? So in a cross-site way, the most important themes that came up that were identified through this analysis were damage and loss and the need for help and support. The most common theme that came up was the experience of emotional distress and the disruption of daily lives, and the most overlooked was psychosocial support and the need to be supported through trauma, immediate and longer term trauma. So what is needed: safer housing and planned relocation, ongoing psychosocial support, stronger support for displaced families, and integration of mental health into emergency responses. I think I've said everything that's on that side. So I just want to acknowledge in this slide the community engagement team researchers in particular who are working at each of the sites in South Africa, Burkina Faso, Kenya, and Mozambique. So thank you, and also funding from Welcome. So I think I'm almost out of time. So I'm really just going to give you the top lines here, because I'm sure there's some questions. So in terms of considerations and challenges of participatory analysis, it's important to note that participatory analysis is emotionally and ethically demanding. And so that it's not just the telling of the story, the going out and the taking of the photographs, the hand drawing of the map, which is emotionally demanding. Obviously, also analysing all of those outputs also puts emotional demands on the participant, and that needs to be recognised and acknowledged and responded to in these analysis processes. So analysis requires moving from experiences and perspectives into understanding patterns and themes. So you need to build in structured opportunities for participants to undertake a collective interpretation from individual contributions. Participatory analysis needs to account for power and context. So visual evidence can't be interpreted outside of broader histories and existing or past systems and structures. So analysis that moves beyond, the immediately visual content is required in order for it to be real and grounded. And the building of consensus is in itself an analytical process. So it's not just limited to identifying themes. It involves negotiating. The CBCRs are, they're not a unit. They themselves, through their own materials, will interpret what's going on differently, what they see as the problems, what they see as solutions. These will be different. So there's a lot of negotiating that has to happen through the analytical process in terms of identifying priorities and responsibilities. It's important to make all voices count. So acknowledging that the insights, the knowledge, the experiences of the people who are directly experiencing these events, experiencing the research problem, is absolutely vital and is needed in order to be able to really understand what interventions are needed. But often there's not a specialist policy knowledge or a specialist technical knowledge within that group, and it really does take a transdisciplinary approach to couch those experiences in a wider perspective and a wider knowledge base around policy and technical aspects. And just to remember that every synthesis, summary, or visual representation involves some kind of interpretive decision, and that runs the risk of altering the original meaning of what somebody drew in their story, or the photograph that they took, or the map that they drew, or the body map, the community map or body map that they drew, or whatever it is that they've made. So just to wrap up then, so through reflecting upon and analysing visual evidence that they have created, people with lived experience of a research challenge can collectively formulate contextually fitting local solutions. They can use their visual materials to propose and argue for community-derived interventions through engagement with other people who are similarly affected, and that includes government officials, policy and decision makers, key stakeholders, and other interest groups, who all need to be in the same room at the same time to really engage with these lived experiences and bring their own knowledge, insights, and perspectives into the mix in order to think about interventions that are going to be contextually appropriate and fit in a relevant way in the context where they're most needed and for the people that they're most needed. So that's it. Thank you. I'm sure there are some questions.
Thank you. That was such a brilliant presentation. And I think those examples really helped us to see, to visualize how you do it, because we hear about these techniques, but we don't really know how you practice it on the ground. So thank you very much for that. I want to know, how easy or difficult is it to keep data analysis and data collection as sort of two distinct phases? Is there room for data generation within data analysis? Because I'm wondering if a participant or a group of participants are analyzing the data and they look at all these wonderful stories, but they realize, wait, there's something I forgot to say, or I've got new ideas about this. Yes. How easy is it to integrate that? Do you integrate that, or do you say, hold on, we've already sort of got our data, this year's about analysis? How do you negotiate that?
Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you. So there's lots of space for integrating things that don't appear in a story or a map or a photograph, that comes through the small working group discussions that happen so they'll watch the stories, look at the maps, look at the photographs, and then have a lot of discussion around that, and especially in the unpacking. And that's why really, so you can come out with these big overarching solutions that all sound very grand and important, and yes, that's definitely needed, and in some cases it's just downright obvious, but it's the unpacking of, okay, so you say that this is needed, but let's look at that in more detail. And why is this needed? Who's responsible, and how can it actually happen? So what are the mechanisms? And that's where all the additional things that people forgot to say or didn't say comes in the unpacking of that. So what do we actually what do we actually need to counteract, to overcome, to mitigate, to adapt to those things that weren't said, all come into those discussions, and that's captured as much as it can be by the facilitation team and by the core researchers who are writing things down and comparing and contrasting and deliberating and all the time through the process. So it takes a long time. It's not, many workshops, many discussions, many confirmations need to happen, and then obviously a lot of preparation for then going into an event with a room full of people from the city of Cape Town or Stellenbosch municipality or whatever it is.
My question's about ethics and consent. So you're calling them, what am I doing? You're calling them co-researchers, but also they're participants. So do you need to get signed informed consent from them as participants or as co-researchers, and how do you navigate that?
So in both cases, right from the very beginning, through project information meetings that were held in all of these different sites with a much larger number of community members who were informed about the meetings through networks and local organisations, it was made very clear that these projects are long-term projects, and it's not just about coming and being a participant in a workshop, but it's about coming into the project as a researcher, as a research partner, where you will be generating data through these different methods, but also analysing it with a lot of support. Obviously, I mean, we have to be authentic here around this. Requires a lot of support in terms of particularly analytical frameworks and things that people follow, but that you're coming into this project as a co-researcher. You will be generating data, you will be analysing data, you will be interpreting that, and you will be presenting it yourself and arguing it for yourself and making a case for yourself. So when it comes to consent, so we have the project information meeting, which is a more general project for a much wider base of community members who, as I say, are invited through wider networks. And then and the explanation there is about the project and that we're looking for community-based co-researchers. And it's a big consideration because it's a huge investment of time on people's behalf. Obviously, they are remunerated for that time. But then they have to really think, can I make myself available, on and off for the next 2 years for this project? And then if they think that they want to do that, then there's another meeting, which is an inception, what we call an inception meeting. It's just a word, where there's a lot more detail that is given about what's involved, managing of expectations, what the research will be able to do, what the research won't be able to do, exactly what the role of the participants is, the risks and implications for them. And then with that information from the inception meeting, they are asked to then sign a consent form to participate in the project as a co-researcher. But at that point, they are not giving permission for their stories to be shared or anything. It's like they're giving consent to become a participant in the project. The sharing of or a co-researcher in the project, I mean, the terms are a little bit interchangeable because they are participating, but they're participating as community-based co-researchers. So they give their consent for that, and then separately the consent process is managed for the sharing of those visual materials, and that's done in a very layered way, where every single decision is about how a story can be shared, who it can be shared, when it can be shared, is taken by the individual. So that's a totally different process of consent for sharing the visual materials. Yeah, but they are giving consent when they give consent to be a community-based co-researcher. They are giving consent to be involved throughout the duration and including all the analysis techniques and everything. But they can withdraw if they want.
Yeah, I think maybe we need to have a follow-up workshop about ethics and how to manage that dynamic, because I'm also thinking about the power balance and you coming in as an expert but also not wanting to position yourself more as a facilitator than so it's I'm in the middle of it and I'm struggling with it, and so I think
it's a lot of what a lot of people have said, that they're really interested in the ethical dimensions of all of this work. So Astrid and I are going to give a lecture on the ethics. We've both written quite a lot about it and do a workshop on it as well. But yeah, that positionality, how you position yourself as a facilitator, kind of like stepping in, stepping back, supporting, allowing, being open, but while still giving people a framework so that they feel held and they know what they're doing, and it's a real give and take, and it's a skill that takes a long time to learn. Yeah, quite a few questions.
Yeah, my first question is on the fact that you indicated that you co-developed the protocol.
Yes, the participatory thematic analysis protocol for the WEMA study, yes.
Yeah, so my question is now, how do you deal with, for example, I'll give you an example of us currently. We're working on a protocol using the participatory, approaches that we are learning from these sessions, but we don't have resources to start engaging with them to be part of the protocol writing process. Okay. We only use maybe literature and maybe what we learn from here to be able to build the protocol. So what would be your advice? Because like, for example, we know we'll do it in Sadana Bay, but we can't go to Sadana Bay and start engaging because we don't even have resources to do that. Secondly, on data analysis, how do you delineate subjectivity by the participants, co-researchers, and the objectivity from the experts, academic experts, because interpretation of the same concept or finding by the owner and by the academic expert who links to the existing body of knowledge sometimes can contradict. So how do you manage that, and how do you also manage retention in this process, because it looks like to be a long process? How is retention like, and how do you manage that? Thanks. Apologies for too many questions. We're here to learn. Huh?
Okay, so when it comes to co-development, what I need to make very clear is that the protocol for the participatory thematic analysis process was co-developed with the community engagement team researchers at the sites. So these are people who are working in human health research institutions. They all have access to the internet. They all have access to Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever. And so, that co-developing a protocol with people under those conditions is very easy. We didn't co-develop the participatory thematic analysis protocol with the community-based co-researchers. That is a different kettle of fish. And yes, the resources to do that are enormous. And this is one of the things that I'm having a lot of conversations about when a funder says that you need to show in your proposal that you're going to follow engaged research principles, and you need to make sure that community engagement involvement is embedded throughout the trajectory of your project, from the design of the protocols right through to the evaluation of the interventions. I think that they haven't thought it through, because that requires years and a lot of money and a lot of logistics and all sorts of things, and we're just not there yet. So I think we can do the best that we can do with the time that we have and the money that we have and the team that we have to engage community members as much as we possibly can. But we also have to be realistic that projects and funding is time bound and resource bound and people bound. And so, like, what can we do? How much can we do to bring people in? And where is it just that? Where are the limitations? And where is it just not possible to involve community members? And I just think we have to be very, very authentic about that, and we have to keep also presenting to the funders why what they're asking for sometimes is just it's just really hard, and sometimes it's impossible, no matter how good the intentions may be. The second question, so we've done a participatory thematic analysis. The framework was given to the community-based co-researchers, and they followed that framework. But they did, they pulled out all of those themes and all of the content around the sub-themes and everything themselves, and that was just documented by the facilitators that were in the room. So, and the participatory thematic analysis stands on its own. It's going to be published on its own. It's being written up at the moment as a cross-site paper by Sitembiso Ndlovu, who's at the African Health Research Institute. He's leading on the publication of the participatory thematic analysis. And you asked about authorship, and we had a long conversation about that last week as well. And then there's also an academic analysis, which is actually being done separately. It's going to be published separately. As I said, it's being led by Chanel, and that brings a more kind of like, an academic perspective from what we know about the literature and what we know about concepts and what we know about themes as academics and as researchers. So they're two separate papers, but we're also hoping to have the time and the resources to be able to do a comparison, right, Astrid? Yes, Astrid's nodding. And in terms of retention, well, it's all part of that project information event and the inception event, where it's made very clear to people right from the very beginning what their, if they want to come into the project and be co-researchers with the research team, what that actually entails, and that it's a long-term commitment. So people know before they start that this is a long-term commitment, and they make that commitment because they want to, and they've expressed a really strong interest to be involved in the project. Inevitably, people will fall away. If they fall away, unless there's a terrible thing that happens and somebody has to step away from the project, once they have committed and started, they stay on. It's very unusual for people to drop out. And if they do drop out, they tend to drop out right at the very beginning. And they stay on unless something happens that completely makes it impossible for them to stay on in the project, because they become very invested in this work. And as a group, as part of a team as well. Yes, Bridget. And then Chanel. There's two questions, and then I think we must stop for...
Just a quick question which follows on from yours. Thank you. I was interested in, you've answered my first question, which is about the participatory thematic analysis and the academic thematic analysis, that they are quite distinct. So that you've answered, thank you. Then I wanted to know, do they run concurrently? Although they are separate, do they run concurrently? Or does the one inform the other, or is one before the other? And what exactly is the purpose of doing both of them, and how would you bring them together? As you've mentioned, you do plan to bring them together.
I think I'm going to hand that question over to Chanel, because Chanel had her hand up, and I just know that she's burning to...
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Firstly, I just wanted to respond to Juliet, who talked about objectivity. So I just wanted to remind everybody and just bring us back to why we do qualitative research. So the purpose of qualitative research is not to generalize. So we're not trying to come up with one answer that is objective and that can be generalized to the entire population. So our objectivity is in us capturing the lived experiences, the voices of the individual, meaning attached within that context. What does that mean for this, in terms of this particular problem within that context? So that on its own is objective because it captures the narrative within the context. We don't take our participants out of their context, but we actually go to them and hear them and listen to them from that perspective. So in that way, that then we would say we have achieved objectivity. Right? So just to answer that. And there was another question in the beginning that was talking about what happens if later on you've already collected the data, but when the participants are going through participatory thematic analysis and there's new data that emerges. So I also just want to respond to that rarely happens because what happens during the process of them actually writing those stories, we go through different stages like Gill has already mentioned. There's a lot of reflection, a lot of writing, and they're also guided in terms of how to write a story, which is a more like a scientific aspect. Gill would have sort of contributed in developing those methodologies. So there's already a scientific methodology that is guiding that process in that where participants actually are generating those stories. And they also, through the process as well, we also sit with them, look at their stories, look at information that we discuss with them. Is this information really necessary? Does it still have to remain in the story? If not, then we can cut down some of that information. So that process comes through. And then when it comes to analysis is also informed by Brown and Clark's framework of thematic analysis. So we have all the stages already highlighted, and then we pass that knowledge to the participants. So then they take that step by step. What is, for this question, what are they looking for? They have a question that is guiding that step. For instance, what is it that's standing out to you in this in the videos that you've just watched? And then if it's an individual activity, they reflect on it individually. If it's a group, they reflect on it within a group, and then they provide those answers. So that's how we ensure objectivity and ensure that we're capturing everything. And in that case, we find that we don't really get anything new that comes out from that process. And to answer the last question, how are these processes taking place in terms of the participatory thematic analysis and the academic thematic analysis? Like Gill had mentioned, so I'm focusing more on the academic thematic analysis. So I'm a little bit out of the context where the studies actually took place. Whereas the CETs, the community engaged teams, they were actually within the communities and they participated with the co-researchers. And so they have like a deeper understanding of all the steps. So we are actually the processes took place concurrently. So Stembiso from Durban and the other social sciences from each team are doing that. They're writing the paper while I'm also writing without the influence of one another. So not influencing each other, but then I write as a social scientist, but who's not embedded in the primary context, but they are writing it as social scientists embedded in the context, and we're writing it concurrently. It's happening at the same time. And then Gill and Astrid to look into those two papers objectively and see where the similarities are. Thank you.
I think we better. Thank you so much for all of the questions, and it's would have loved to have gone into a lot more detail about the different processes and activities and everything, but I hope at least that you have a sense of the steps and what's involved in participatory thematic analysis of creative. research outputs. So we'll call it a day there. We'll draw it to a close there. We'll have a cup of tea, and then we'll come back and we'll do our workshop for those who are able to stay. Thank you very, very much.